Hello, and welcome to Making the Rounds, a podcast by the American Medical Association featuring advice, interviews, and discussions on the most important topics impacting residents' lives and careers. In this episode, Wes Cleveland, senior attorney with the AMA, discusses how to approach the topic of compensation while you're negotiating your contract. Wes has been a practicing attorney for the past 23 years, and prior to joining the AMA, worked for the Texas Attorney General, the Texas Medical Association, and in private practice representing physicians. This episode of Making the Rounds is one in a 6-part series on navigating contract negotiations from start to finish. Here's Wes Cleveland.
All right, let's turn our attention now to compensation. There's a number of elements to compensation. I'm just going to hit a few for you here. One is signing bonus. That's a question that I've received from residents at a number of presentations. And whether or not the employer is going to offer you a signing bonus is just going to depend on the employer. For example, I remember when I was giving a presentation up in Minnesota, and one of my co-presenters was an HR representative from a gastroenterology group up in that area. And she said, as a general proposition, the medical group did not offer new physician signing bonuses, just as a matter of policy, on the grounds that their organization thought that either you want to work here or you don't. So that was their policy. So, you'll read a lot on the internet, mostly, about signing bonuses and maybe what you can expect. But just because, I bring that point up just to illustrate that, the compensation methodology will just vary very much by the uniqueness of the employer. So just because a potential employer doesn't offer a signing bonus doesn't mean that that's not a good place to work. It's just going to be a case-by-case basis. But one thing you can do is you can go up on the internet if you're interested in what a signing bonuses might be available to you, and just see what ranges are, let's say, for cardiology, or if there's a range for primary care physicians. That could give you at least a very general idea. And then if you talk to a lawyer who knows the local market and possibly your potential employer, he or she may give you some insight too. Also, relocation expenses will very typically be part of your initial overall compensation. These can range significantly, $5,000, $10,000, maybe more. So that'll be something you'll want to ask about as well. And then also, compensation can also include payment of your student loans, particularly as employment continues. So that can be part of the package as well. Now, I've already mentioned to you about some of the national surveys out there that residents frequently ask me about. And I will tell you, like I said, that whether it's MGMA or Sullivan-Cotter or one of the other national surveys, they are expensive. So I'd say you probably won't be interested in buying one of those yourself, but like I said before, your attorney will very likely have access to that information if he or she is regularly negotiating employment contracts for physicians. But I will say that if you want to look at some publicly available survey information, I can suggest a couple websites. One is just salary.com. And so you can look up physician salaries on there. So that's a resource that I have heard suggested by some HR representatives from hospital chains. And then another resource that has been mentioned to me is something called Doximity. And you may have heard about that. And I would suggest you take a look at that if you want to see something that's publicly available. And I've checked out both of those, and you can get some information off those. So now remember, regardless of what resource you're working with. Like I said, whether it's going to be something that's publicly available or whether it's going to be one of these national surveys, remember that those are just generalities. So it's local conditions are really going to dictate what your compensation is going to be in total. But again, you can work with your attorney on that. Okay. Now let's talk about compensation methodologies. There's many, many different ways that you can be paid. So one way, which will probably be familiar to you, is straight salary. Now, we don't find that to be as common as it once was. I have heard that there are still some large medical groups that work off salary, just pay a straight salary to the physician, but typically that's not the usual compensation methodology. What we usually find is some sort of salary and then productivity component as well. So there'll be a set salary amount for you coming in, but then your compensation and possibly a bonus will be based on some other productivity measure. Now, I don't want to go too much into the details on this, but what has been predominant in the past is measuring your productivity by these things called work RVUs. And if you want to find out more information about that, we do have some resources that will help explain that to you that I'll reference at the end of this presentation. But so I guess what I'm saying to you is there will be right now some kind of productivity function built into your compensation. And that's the idea because that's implemented because the hospital or whoever your employer is will want to make sure that you are sufficiently motivated to put in your full efforts to be productive for the employer. So again, compensation and then some kind of productivity. The one thing also that I think it's important to keep in mind is it's okay, it would be perfectly normal to have a productivity component in your compensation. But I think what you need to think about and ask the employer about this, you can ask your colleagues about this as well, is get your head around the extent to which the productivity expectations are such that you can meet those expectations realistically. And again, this will feed back into issues we have about what other administrative duties you might have with respect to your employment. I mean, if we're basing your compensation in part on your productivity, that means that your compensation is going to be a function of how much clinical care you're going to be providing. Anything that takes away from that is going to have some impact on your overall compensation, how you're going to be evaluated by the organization. So that's important to keep in mind. Remember also, and I've also touched about this when we talked about some of the new not purely fee-for-service compensation models. And so what I mean by this is your compensation now, most likely, or will be trending in this direction, is that your compensation or your bonus will more and more be a function of how you or your patients are performing with respect to the quality measures that are applicable to your practice. Quality does include patient satisfaction scores, and then also how your performance is doing with respect to certain utilization goals. For example, how often or what the percentage of the time is that you are prescribing generic medications vis-a-vis brand name medications, something like that. Okay, now what I want to do is talk to you about something that's a consideration purely for if you're working for a physician practice. And this is called buying in to become an owner of the practice. Now, typically this isn't going to be available in the hospital setting because you don't buy into the hospital, okay? But you can buy into the physician practice. And by doing so, you become an owner of that practice. So when you enter into your first employment agreement, what we typically see is after the first year, maybe the second year, third year, you will have an opportunity to become an owner, all right? And that means you have an opportunity, assuming that your performance has been acceptable, you're in good standing with the group, that you can purchase shares and, like I said, become a part owner of the practice. And it's to recognize the patient base that you've built with the assistance of the practice. So in this case, like I said, it's between 1, 2, or 3 years. What I would make sure of here is that it's very carefully spelled out the conditions under which you can buy into the practice, all right? And this isn't a sort of conversation that you should postpone until after, the first, second, or third years. You want to have this very clear up front, okay? So that when the time comes for you to make this big move, everybody is going to be on the same page, all right? Now, one thing I want you to be cognizant of, too, is that traditionally, physicians who are working in independent practices have accepted a little bit lower than what might be the full fair market value of their compensation to help build up their investment in the practice. In other words, to help them pay forward, in other words, drop down how much they're ultimately going to have to pay in the end of the third year or the second year when they buy into the practice. That's traditionally what we've seen. So they kind of build up, they reduce the purchase price because they're foregoing some of that compensation on the front end. One thing I do want to say also before we leave the discussion about compensation models, I want to back up a little bit here, is that sometimes what we've seen in employment agreements is that the compensation models are sometimes not very well spelled out. So I think it would be useful if there's any question about what the compensation model entails and what the expectations are under that model. I think it might not be a bad practice to ask the potential employer of a concrete example, of a specific example of what compensation amounts could look like under a given scenario, just to make sure that you totally understand, both you and your employer understand what that model is and what are the possible implication of the models, and then how you can succeed under those models and what you can expect to earn under those models if you work a certain amount of time or you're able to achieve a certain amount of productivity.
That was Wes Cleveland, senior attorney on fair compensation. Be sure to check out the other episodes in this 6-part series about the ins and outs of contract negotiation. For more information on how to plan for your transition to practice, visit ama-assn.org/career planning. You can also subscribe to Making the Rounds and other great AMA podcasts on iTunes and Google Play, or visit ama-assn.org/podcasts. Thanks for listening.